my family and background was in India. You're going to say to me, why were you in India? The answer was that my forebear, Samuel Osborne, on my mother's side, went out to India at the time of the Indian Mutiny, otherwise known as the First War of Independence. He was in the Hampshire Rifles, and they landed, I think, probably in Bombay, and they marched to Cawnpore, and then from Cawnpore they went up to Lucknow to relieve the garrison there. And they must have all have been incredibly tough people, because this was 107 degrees or something, and they were in their red coats. And I think the Indians thought it was a bit of a foul, because they arrived and went straight into action, whereas they thought they'd probably rest overnight. Anyway, so he was in Hampshire Rifles and everything calmed down, but he obviously didn't go back into the army. He became an engineer, and his son was an engineer who put in the railway system in India, and then his son was an engineer and put in the tramway system, particularly in Bombay, and then he went on to design dams, which is why he was working in Srinagar. My mother was born on the Dala Lake on a boat called the Water Witch, that's right. So that's how they all ended up in India, and I was the fourth generation born there. On my father's side, there'd been a long line of farmers up in Aberdeen, and farmed at a house called the Mains at Glenbucket, and they were fine up there until the Depression, when the farm had to go. It was bought by the Earl of Cowdray, who used it as grouse shooting. So that's why they were there. They came down to London because there was no work, and my grandfather worked in a draper's on Ludgate Hill, and my father joined Thomas Cook's as a young lad of 17, and very quickly was sent out to Egypt, where they ran the Thomas Cook's Nile service, and then from there he got himself transferred by Thomas Cook's to India, and lived and worked in Bombay. And he joined the TA, he joined the Bombay Light Horse, and here's his little forage cap. Yeah, so this was his cavalry cap, and he went into action in Bombay in the rioting, and during the rioting they used to throw soda siphons off the tops of buildings, which of course, and they hit the ground, they blew up like a grenade. So the troop horses went down in droves, so he wasn't very chuffed with that. Anyways, that was his time. We had his sword, but unfortunately when we were burgled it was stolen, so that was a great sadness, because he had 3 polo ponies, and he was used to riding up and down Juhu Beach, which is now all been built over, and he was then in the TA, and the war broke out, and he was called up into the Indian Army, and they had a huge number of officers. They called it the Indian Army Officers Reserve, and he was posted to Dehradun to run a prison camp, for a POW camp, and there were Italians who were surrendering like stink, and they weren't going to escape. They didn't even try to escape because there's for 3 meals a day. This is my father's pass, army in India. This is to get into the prison camp, sorry. Dated 1942, so before I'd arrived. And they had one escapee, that was Heinrich Harrer, who escaped and did the home run for people, the Germans and so on, if they did escape, was Goa. But he did the opposite. He went up north and became secretary to the Dalai Lama, and wrote a book later on called 7 Years in Tibet. So that takes us to the war, and I was born in the camp 1943, 27th of May, and my brother Graham had been, well, he was 2 years older, so he was already there, and I think it was a fairly congenial time. Italians weren't going anywhere, the Germans were a bit of a nuisance, and they had the odd Japanese who, well, they killed themselves basically. Right, well, one of the things that the prisoners did, Italian prisoners did, was to occupy themselves making things. Now, this is a lovely box that was made by a prisoner. It's on the back, it says POW Magni Aldo, Camp 23, Clement Town, India. And he gave this he gave this box to my mother, and I guess he was a jeweller. And there were others, and there's a painting of the camp itself under construction. But they weren't going to go anywhere, and they were no trouble to anyone. And my mother said it was wonderful because in the evenings they would all sing their songs from their local villages, and it was beautiful. They just sang, and I recall that when we were in the prisoner of war camp and living in a bungalow, a tiger used to come every night to sleep on the veranda. He was probably injured and therefore looking for somewhere safe for the night. The servants were terrified of it because it was probably a man-eater. And I do remember we went from the camp to Simla and lived in what is now the Oberoi Hotel, and I went to school on an elephant, which is curious. After the war ended, we as a family went to Calcutta, and all the prisoners went to a holding camp at Bombay. It was called Doolally, that's right, they all went to Doolally. So we were in Calcutta in 1947, and just as the Great Killing started, this was when partition happened, and Muslims and Hindus were butchering one another in Calcutta particularly. So Gandhi decided to visit to try and dampen things down, and I remember we were all going to go and see him speak and try and tell the locals not to kill one another all the time, and we were going to Eden Park just to hear him talk, and I remember saying to my father, "Is he the king or something?" And my father said, "No, he's not, he's a bloody little nuisance." Anyway, the Great Killing was in full swing, and we went by train from Calcutta to Bombay, and the train in front of us had been stopped, and all the passengers were checked over. If they were on the wrong side, they got butchered, and so that when our train went through, there were all these bodies lying the side of the track. However, we got ourselves safely to Bombay, and then we're reunited with the prisoners of war, and we all went off in a ship called the Franconia, heading for England. Now, the prisoners actually were quite contented to be prisoners, so they put up a big stand at Naples that they didn't want to get off, and they had to get the Marines to move them. So the ship then went to Franconia, bless it, went on to Liverpool, and that's where we got off and met the family at Victoria Station, which must have been quite emotional. I remember Graham and I helping ourselves to a loaf of sugar, and my aunt saying to us, "Well, we've all been through a war, you know, and you shouldn't be eating this lump sugar." So we were ticked off. We hadn't been in the country in more than 5 minutes. Anyways, we got down to Hove and stayed with my grandparents. My grandfather was, he'd been, after the war, he worked in the power station at Shoreham. He wasn't a very well man, he had heart problems, and it wasn't very nice for him to have two lively little lads wished on him. And we spent our time prowling around bomb sites, picking up scrap metal. So 1950, leaving Graham behind here, we went back to India and to Lahore, and lived in a hotel in Lahore, which I forget the name of. I think it was called the Sunny Fields or something hotel, and lived there for a year. I went to school at St Andrews, where the one of the other pupils was Tariq, as it was in a Tariq Alley. So that's nothing to boast about, really. There was a man there whose sole job was to make sure you kept your hands visible at all times. And if your hands disappeared into your lap, he got out and gave you a good old whack with a stick. So it did make sure that you did stay alert. And father working still for Thomas Cook's. I should have said that after the war he lost his job at Thomas Cook's and became secretary to the Maharaja of Rewa, so off he went tiger hunting and stuff. But then he got his job back with Thomas Cook's, and the rest for him was history. He carried on with Cook's until he ended up as, when he finally came back to England, he was European controller, so he did pretty well. So Lahore, we went to Calcutta for independence. I know my mother was not that pleased because we had Mountbatten and Mrs. Mountbatten, Edwina, was in our hotel, and she used to swim very early morning, scantily clad, with Nehru cavorting in the pool, and she thought that was pretty offside. Independence came, and we went to see the British Union Jack lowered and the Indian flag go up. My mother was terribly upset, as you can imagine, being such a long history for her family in India. Anyway, we saw the Union Jack come down and the Indian flag go up, and the rioting by and large had ended. It was horrific in its time. We saw lots and lots of bodies, and Graham and I used to go out and count them, nice little boys we were. And then 1952, we returned to England via Bombay again, stayed at the Taj Mahal Hotel, which was quite decent, and lived in a hotel called the Great Eastern, which Rosie and I went to see, but it was being refurbed, so you couldn't get in. But it was quite a spectacular hotel. And I do remember they used to do enormous ice statues in the dining room, wonderful works of art, which of course during the day melted. But so we got ourselves back to Bombay, and then my mother and I came back via Gibraltar. I was put ashore at Gibraltar because I had an infection. And they also put off a boy that I'd beaten up. He irritated me to the extent that I got a hold of him and banged his head on the deck. But he was put off for treatment as well. But got back to Liverpool again. And that is the end of my Indian connection. So Marsh Court was a very happy place. There were only 36 boys, I think, in this magnificent Lutyens building overlooking the River Test, and we were very happy there. Mr. Wright, who ran the place, was called Whacker because he did. I could still hear the sound of some poor little boy being thrashed in his study. Obviously, he wasn't to blame. So from Marsh Court, I was there till I was 14, went on to Lancing, which was unusual because none of the former pupils went on to Lancing. They all went to Marlborough and Wellington, curiously. Lancing was also a very happy place. It was a kind of an arty place, and there were lots and lots of sons of the arts, like Neville Shute, and the pupils also turned out to be, big names in the theatre. Tim Rice, Christopher Hampton. There were also diplomats. So it was a very happy place, dominated by the chapel, which is enormous, and like I say, a lot of the pupils went off into the church. Didn't distinguish myself terribly at Lancing. I boxed through the college. I was a Queen's Scout and had the Award of Merit for Life Saving. Graham was a very fine swimmer and swam to the college. But then my poor old dad, his money ran out. I'd been supported by Thomas Cook's, and they suddenly pulled the plug by saying, well, you're never going to go back to India, so we're not going to fund this anymore. So that was a bit of a crisis, and I had to leave. But Lancing were very good. They put me in touch with the Public Schools Appointments Bureau. A very nice man arrived with a suitcase full of jobs. Which one would you like, he said. And he said, I've been through them myself. We could get you an apprenticeship at the Bank of England. Do you fancy that? It's lousy pay, but they're quite good holidays. And so I did that. In fact, it was quite a stroll. I went for an interview with lots of very important people. There was a panel of 5, and 4 of them were knights of the realm. So that was quite daunting. But they asked me sort of simple questions. What sports do you play? I don't suppose you play rugby, because they don't do that at Lancing, do they? No, sir. But the bank was good. I had a 3-year apprenticeship and then joined the permanent staff. I got a final warning during that time for sending a sausage through the internal post, which was not the sort of thing one did. And I had to go, and they said to me, you go and see your manager on Monday. If I was you, I'd polish my shoes, because you're going to get a bollocking. So I did indeed get a bollocking. He had a massive desk, and there was nothing on it apart from this sausage. So he said, did you send this through the internal post? Yes, sir. Why? Well, because I thought it was funny. Why? Give up on him. And he said, well, this is a final warning. Any more of your high-spirited antics and you'll be out of here. So I decided I'd better behave. That is where I met Rosie, the lovely Rosie. She was quite small, and still is. And she was on the counter and couldn't really see the customers. So I got her a box to stand on. And that was the sort of thing that endeared me to her. I became chairman of the Citizens Advice Bureau, which meant that I presented at Guildhall the figures to get the funding for the year, which was probably about £1 million. And we had the whole offices refurbed and was opened by Princess Anne, bless her heart. She came along and opened, and I remember saying to her, I expect you're fed up with the smell of paint. So I was also chairman of the Greater London Association for Pre-Retirement. So all of these extramural things kept me out of mischief. And when I retired, I was granted the freedom of the City of London, which doesn't mean a huge lot these days. It means that I can be hanged using a silken rope. I can herd my sheep across London Bridge, and I may wear a sword in public. Rosie didn't really enjoy being in the Bank of England, so she resigned and went on to work at the airport for TWA, which she loved. She was at Heathrow, I was at the bank. So yes, we got married in 1972 and were living in Raysbury because that was a handy place for the airport. She was renting a house called Many Trees with her chums, and one day she went across the road to pay her rent to the owner and jokingly said, look, we are house hunting and getting absolutely nowhere. You weren't thinking of selling Many Trees, were you, by any chance? To which Eileen Aston said, yes, we are, funnily enough. So we scurried around and got a mortgage and bought Many Trees. Well, not all of it. The bigger portion, leaving the cottage end, continuing to be let by the Astons. Later we acquired the cottage end of the place on the roadside, and then little bits and pieces of the garden. So it was a bit like playing Monopoly. We kept buying little bits and pieces until the end we had the whole parcel of Many Trees, and it was fit for a family. And the first incumbent was young Nicholas, and then followed by Timothy, and finally Anna. So we had our family all sorted out. Became treasurer of the parish church, and I'm still trying to get rid of that job. I've been treasurer for 42 years. But it's a dear little church if anyone wants to go and have a look at it. And it was there that Anna was married. All three children were christened there. So it has a great warmth in our hearts. So I spent many happy years commuting to London on the trains, which at the time of the IRA troubles wasn't much fun. We had to keep getting off the train, walking down the track, getting to Waterloo that way. But the bank had a society, a narrowboat society, which we joined, and we had some lovely, lovely holidays going around the country on the canals and enjoying ourselves. I can't recollect if anyone fell in, but...
Rosie did.
Oh, Rosie, yes, she did. She did. Rosie fell in. She slipped off in a lock, which was quite hazardous. But there were lots and lots of happy moments on the boat. We There are some wonderful places to visit. The children acquired a sea magnet, which you could use when it moored up and dredge up all sorts of interesting things that have fallen in the canal. No, happy days they were. Anyway, so 40 years later, I handed in my notice and got my P45 in return, and then spent 8 very happy years lecturing for Towery Law financial advisors all over the country. There were places that I'd never been to because the Bank of England only had a few branches, which later in my life I spent closing down. But Towery Law sent me all over the country, and it was great fun. There were hysterical places to stay in. I remember the Royal Hotel in Crewe, where I walked in with my briefcase and they thought I was the VAT inspector. But in fact, when I booked it, the girl did say, "Stay?" That was some feeling it was a crummy hotel, and by golly, it was a crummy hotel. And I thought she'd said £80 a night. Turned out to be £18 a night. So it was a crummy hotel. And in fact, all the people on the DEFRA course thought it was hysterical that I'd stayed there, just to start the course off. And then there were people who came and talked about benefits and taxation and stuff. And the intention, of course, at the end of the course was that you gave them a piece of paper to say, would you like an interview with an advisor, and roughly how much have you got to invest? Which was quite interesting because people from the prison service in particular were put down sort of 400,000, and you think, oh, you've been on the take, obviously. Happy days. And the rest is history, as you say, because then I retired completely, exhausted by life's vigours.